Okay, today we're diving into a really interesting forecast. It points to the year 2026 as having a higher than usual risk for a major heat event. And this isn't just a guess. It's based on a mathematical model that tries to find predictable patterns in how big changes happen. So, what's this all about? At its heart, it's a forecast that's basically putting a big red flag on the year 2026, saying there's an increased chance of a significant heat wave. The big question is, how in the world did they arrive at that conclusion? Let's unpack the model step by step. Now you're probably asking, who came up with this? And that's a fair question. This forecast comes from the work of a researcher and author named Kevin L. Brown. It's all based on a model he developed, and we're going to walk through his framework and what it found. All right, let's get into the nuts and bolts. To really get why 2026 is the year being talked about, we first have to understand the theory that's running in the background. The theory is called Triune Harmonic Dynamics, or THD for short. And the big idea here is actually pretty simple. Huge changes, well, they don't just happen out of nowhere. The model says they follow predictable patterns of pressure building up in a system, and then, eventually, that pressure gets released. To make this super simple, think about a water balloon. You've got that long, slow process of filling it up with water, right? That's the pressure building. Then there's the quick action, the squeeze, that releases it all. According to the THD model, that squeeze doesn't do much unless the tension is already built up inside. Okay, so you've got this pressure and release thing. That core idea builds into what the framework calls an engine of change, a fundamental three-part process that THD suggests is behind basically every transformation. And it's a really simple 1, 2, 3 sequence. First, you start at the base, which is just the normal, everyday state of things. Then comes the drive. That's when the pressure and tension start to ramp up. And finally, you get the release, where all that stored up energy pushes the system into a totally new state. The key is, without that drive phase, the release just doesn't have much of an impact. But wait, it gets a little more detailed than that. The pressure doesn't just build up smoothly and evenly. According to this model, it builds in stages that get more and more intense, kind of like waves that just keep getting bigger and bigger over time. This is where we get into what's called the 3-6-9 pattern. You can just think of them as different levels of energy. A 3-phase, that's an early buildup. A 6-phase is a much stronger build, and a 9-phase, well, that signals a major release, where all that pent-up energy finally lets go. Okay, so we've got our core concepts, pressure, release, and these intensifying cycles. Now we can finally take this framework and apply it to Earth systems to see why the year 2026 is the one that stands out. Here's how the THD model looks at our planet. It suggests there are these really slow, long-term cycles where pressure builds up. But at the same time, there are also much faster, short-term cycles that act like timing triggers. And here's the real kicker. The risk of a major event doesn't come from just one of these cycles. It skyrockets when these different cycles overlap. This brings us to what's called the two-layer setup for the 2026 forecast. You have layer 1, which is a long planetary pressure cycle that's been building tension for years. Think of this as the loaded system. Then you have layer 2, a monthly timing point, which the model calls a gate. It's often linked to the new moon. Now, in most years, that gate opens when the background pressure is just kind of normal. But here's the key. The forecast says that in 2026, those monthly timing gates swing open while that background pressure cycle is already in a high-energy, elevated phase. It's kind of like the difference between opening a door on a calm day versus opening that same door during a hurricane. The action is the same, but the result is way more powerful because the background conditions are so much more intense. And the model gets very specific, identifying these windows of heightened risk. These dates are seen as potential release points. Now, I want to be really clear about this. These are not predictions that something will happen on these dates. They're identified as higher risk timing points, times when the probability of a release is just greater. So, why the focus on the middle of the year, especially July? Well, it's because that's when the model shows the slow pressure wave and the faster monthly gates reaching what it calls a stronger harmonic alignment. It's basically the moment when the two cycles are forecasted to sync up most powerfully, which really amplifies the potential for release. All right, this brings us to the single most important concept in this entire forecast. Seriously, if you remember one thing from all of this, it should be the idea of overlap. The whole theory is that these huge, extreme events aren't random. They happen when the slow-building pressure cycles and the faster timing cycles line up just right. It's this convergence, where the peak of the long wave hits at the same time as the peak of a short wave, that creates the perfect conditions for a major release. It suggests these things aren't just bolts from the blue. And that, right there, is why 2026 gets flagged. The forecast suggests that the overlap between these pressure and timing cycles is going to be way stronger than in a typical year. The alignment is more precise, the background pressure is projected to be higher, and all of that just ramps up the probability of a major event.
Now look, this is a forecast based on one specific model, right? But it leaves us with a really fascinating question to think about. If major events in our world aren't entirely random, but are actually the result of overlapping cycles and hidden patterns, what other patterns might we be missing?